Welcome back to my channel. This is Katrina Sargent or Devil Doll Custom Creations. Today I'm going to do the easiest glitter candy cane tutorial ever. I'm adding a bonus at the end of this video. Start out with a sanded and prepped tumbler, and then I hit mine with the heat gun so it's slightly warm to the touch so your epoxy goes on extra thin. You don't want a thick coat of epoxy when you're doing Epoxy Method glittering. You're just going to make sure your entire tumbler is covered in this thin coat of epoxy. Then once that's done, you're going to glitter. I usually glitter starting at the bottom and then work myself up to the rim so I know where I've glittered and where I haven't for the first coat. Since this is Epoxy Method, if you do a little bit thicker coat of epoxy, you will need to do 2 to 3 coats of this glitter to make sure your epoxy is completely covered and there's no wet looking spots. Then once it's fully covered, tap off the extra and let it dry fully before moving on to epoxy. There are many different ways to epoxy. This is raw glitter, so I tend to be heavy-handed. So what I normally do is I kind of let my finger drag a thicker layer around the tumbler before I move on to make sure it is fully coated. You cannot do this when you have multiple colors or something that can stray. Since this is a single color, I can do that. You don't want to put pressure on your finger because you can create micro bubbles. There's other ways, so many YouTube videos on how to epoxy. You find the way you like and you go with it. I only use fast set for this first color since it's a darker color, but since it is fast set, you have to go fairly faster. So as soon as I get my epoxy applied, I hit it with my heat gun after a few minutes, and then only a few more minutes after that, I hit it with my torch to pop any micro bubbles. Unlike regular epoxy, I wait 15 minutes between heat gun and my torch. You're going to do a flood coat just to make sure you get that glass-like finish before you move on to your white stripes. So if you're using regular epoxy, you're going to wait till it's no longer rolling, right? So you can touch it and your epoxy won't come back on your hands. This is fast set, so I only waited about an hour and a half before I moved on to my flood coat. Let this cure fully before you move on to your wet sand and your rim. You need to have a little bit of silver on your rim before you move on to this step. So here you're just needing to measure the length of your white stripes. I like it to wrap fully around to the opposite side as where it started. So this one is just barely over 11 inches for this 30-ounce skinny. I go 12 inches on this just to give a little bit overhang so you can play with later. I will show you that here in a minute. On my silhouette, I create a rectangle. The length that you're wanting, I will fill it in a color just so it's easier to view. So from here, I am then going to go to the bottom part of that rectangle and I'm going to change the size. So I'm going to bring it in on both sides so it tapers down slightly so you won't have to have different gaps between the bottom and the top. And then once you're happy with the width difference between the top and the bottom, I pull it to the side and I duplicate that exact one. So in Silhouette, it's going to be hold the Alt key until the little plus sign comes to duplicate it, or you can do copy and paste. And then if I'm doing a wine glass, I just make that shorter in length so it keeps the same dimensions top and bottom, it's just shorter. But since I'm doing a 30-ounce skinny, I'm going to stick to the 12-inch. So then I'm just duplicating this to fill up an entire page. You don't have to do an entire page. I always prefer to have more than need it later and I didn't create enough. So here is all of my vinyl cuts for my larger stripes of my candy cane. I'm doing glossy vinyl to cut this out on white vinyl. Then I move on to my thinner lines. I take the exact same one and I just bring it into a thinner size. Here I changed it to a different color so you can see the different sizes next to each other. Play around with this, figure out what size you prefer back and forth. I prefer my candy canes to not be 100% perfect pattern, so I don't follow a pattern. But if you are OCD or you like your candy canes to be in the exact same repeating pattern, you can cut yours out in a pattern with your large and small in a pattern together. That will help you in the long run. So I cut out an entire 12 by 12 of these stripes, but then I cut mine in half and removed the extras. I left a little tab for when you're weeding it after you glitter. It makes it so much easier. Now you're gonna need 2 sheets of parchment paper or something that you can remove on top of each other. The top one is gonna be the one you Mod Podge on, so if you go over it, your glitter doesn't stick to it. Then you're gonna remove it before you glitter. I have matte Mod Podge. You can use any that you have on hand. So I just take a brush and I slop it on, and then I go around and smooth out any extra amounts. And then glitter. I do the edges first because the edges will dry the fastest when you're Mod Podging. Then once you have full coverage, you're going to tap off the extra and then replace it back into your shaker. Here's where that little tab comes in handy. You're just going to weed your vinyl and then set it off the side to dry fully before sealing. Now I'm moving on to my thinner lines, exactly like I did that one. And once it is fully dry, you can move on to the sealing part. I usually do 3 generous coats, slightly more heavy each coat, to make sure the glitter is completely sealed in. Then once that is fully dry, you're just going to brush off any extra loose glitter. Sometimes you might have extra on the sides that you removed before you Mod Podged and glittered. You can take a X-Acto knife and slice that off. I take my first strip and I make sure my top corner is hanging over the edge of my tumbler. And I kind of just keep my strip taut as I wrap it around the tumbler. You can remove your vinyl and fix any shapes or how you like your candy cane stripes to look. I tend to not like mine to get like a harsh S. However, the more you remove this, the more your glitter can flake off the vinyl. If that happens, it's easier just to remove that vinyl and add a new one than try to fix it later. I just go back and forth between my small and my big in no particular pattern. I changed my width between my white stripes often, so the red stripes don't look unified as well. Like I said, if you prefer to have a certain pattern, have at it. It's up to you. This is your tumbler. I just have the extra overhang over the edge and I wrap it into the tumbler, and then I wrap the edge of the bottom on the bottom. You'll see what I do at the bottom here in a few minutes. Since we tapered our white stripes in the Silhouette Studio, you won't have to change the direction of your lines very much. However, this is not a straight tumbler. This is slightly tapered. So here I am just adjusting slightly to get a uniformed look. If you have any extra white glitter around, I just take my craft knife and kind of scrape it off before I brush it and seal it again. It's so much easier to get that now than later in the process. Once I'm happy with how the stripes look, I'm going to move on to the bottom. Since I just kind of folded them over, you're going to have them sometimes overlapping. They're not going to be very pretty. So I cut off the extras, and then I measure that distance and then cut a vinyl circle out. I'll show you later. Now I go to the rim. I take a very, very sharp knife and I'm going to trim off the extra on the rim. Do kind of a saw motion. Don't push it because it can pull your vinyl. But you're going to want to see silver along the white strips, just like you do on the red strips. This is why we do our rims before we move on to this, so you're not going to be cutting into that vinyl later. Once I'm happy with it, I am going to clear coat it again before I even do my quick coat from CCDIY. Let that dry before you move on to epoxy. Since this is over white, I do not use fast set over white. So this is my normal artist resin from CCDIY. So it's the normal cure times, 6 hours turning. So I don't hit it with my heat gun until about 15 minutes after I apply the epoxy. And then 15 minutes after that, I hit it with my torch to pop any micro bubbles. Not all epoxy resins can handle this kind of heat. This is why I love CCDIY resins. You have to know your own epoxy and what it can handle. If it only can handle heat gun versus torch, or torch not heat gun, you need to know that of your epoxy. Look at how beautiful those divided lines are. There is no bleed over, there is no nothing, since we sealed it so well before we epoxied. So after that epoxy has cured, I sanded and then I measure the bottom and just cut out a vinyl piece to cover the bottom edges before I move on to my final coat. Please like, share, subscribe, and hit that bell icon so you're notified anytime I post new videos. Thank you for watching. Bonus material coming up. If you've watched this long, you're going to get a bonus. Instead of using Mod Podge, use an adhesive spray. Here I'm using Loctite. You spray it and you glitter exactly the same way. You might have to do 2 coats before you weed, but sometimes it's still faster than Mod Podging. It is preference, but now you have 2 ways to achieve the perfect candy cane tumblers without having to use double-sided tape ever. you need to seal it the same way you did for Mod Podge. Here I'm going to show you a wine glass. So since it is so harshly tapered on the bottom, even with doing a tapered cut vinyl, you still have to change the direction a little bit. You're still going to be a lot closer on the bottom together than you are at the top. But since we tapered it before we cut our stripes out, it's not as noticeable than if you didn't taper your vinyl at all. Thank you so much for watching it all the way to the end. I really do truly appreciate it. Please find me on any of the social medias. I have my own Facebook Tumblr group, facebook.com Devil Doll Community. Please come talk, ask questions, show your creations. Thank you very much.